for me, part of the way to address this rights-based is to talk about a different sort of right. And I think this may come from being a progressive Protestant. I'm very clear that we haven't, as a nation, always read the Second Amendment in the same way. The Supreme Court, as you pointed out when you posed this question, hasn't always read it the same way. Our lawmakers have not always read it the same way. And that could change again. I think there is a path to revisiting the interpretation of the Second Amendment and seeing it as the relic of history that it is.
Big two-part question, but first, where do you see the areas of effective activism? And then how do communities of faith make sure they don't lose their way trying to be effective in basically a poisonous spirit?
I think we represent some consensus, but none of us thinks that we're the consensus of our entire faith tradition. What you said, Rabbi Linda, about Judaism in general, I could say about Baptists. I don't think there's a consensus. There's a larger problem that this is a symptom of. Again, 90% of people say you should have universal background checks. I mean, we could go on and on. Most people, Father, are actually operating in some realm of common sense. How do we make the gun rating not work to the advantage of people in what are presumed to be safe districts?
I don't know how to translate that into a political activism plan, executable with the project manager and so on, right? I don't know. But it seems to me that as religious leaders, our congregations have to be inspired into taking ownership of this thing, right? We need to feel it, and we need to move from the common sense that is apparent amongst us into action. And I think it's that religious, I hate to use this next F word, the religious fervor is a part, maybe a large part of this answer. We need to take ownership of this as religious leaders and as congregants.
But it's very clear to me that as people of God, however we all understand God in our own lives, that we are bringing the prophetic, justice-seeking, life-seeking, pro-reasonable parts of our lives together in everything that we do. As members of a religious community who define ourselves however we define ourselves as religious, whatever that means, and I know that can mean an enormous range of ways, however we define ourselves, we at least are defining ourselves as giving the voice of morality and of giving the voice of the prophets to our contemporary world. And we can stand for justice. And we can do that, as Reverend Callahan was saying, by standing up in elections, by voting, by making sure that we hold our elected officials accountable, that we just keep on working and never give up, and that we will eventually get there. Right? I'm back to building the Messianic age, that we'll do it. It may take a while, but we'll never do it if we give up.
So there is that connection between gun violence and poverty. And most of the victims of gun violence, not all of course, are poor people. And if they're not poor people, they are people who are mentally disturbed or showing signs of mental disturbance, such as the unfortunate fellow in Washington at the Navy Yard. From my experience in North Philadelphia, if I see that two fellows went into a convenience store and tried to rob a cash register and wound up being shot or shooting someone, I usually think they're driven by a drug culture of which they're already victims. They're driven by a poverty culture of which they're already victims. And to some degree, they're desperate. Or they're so desperate for drugs or so driven by poverty that they don't even realize the consequences of what they're doing, especially if they're very young.
There are various public health strategies related to gun and violence culture that I think we might need to give some attention to. Some of which say young people who grow up in cultures where every time you hear a pop, you duck, are already traumatized. When you've buried multiple members of your family, you already know what guns do. And we need to be doing some interventions from a public health perspective. Some of the children are being diagnosed as ADHD in schools, when what they really have is PTSD. So I do think that there's a strategy, there's a public health strategy that needs to be employed and needs to proliferate with the reality of gun violence that speaks to the damage beyond death, before death, that people experience.
I've talked to enough people on the other side of this issue, and one of the great sources of the emotion you see around the issue is it doesn't really speak to guns. It speaks to the notion that activists for gun control don't understand the people for whom guns are an important part of their lives, and that they actively have disdain and contempt for them. So my question to you as religious leaders is, how do you change that conversation in your own congregation so that you're approaching the other side with compassion, with respect, from the Christian tradition, agape?
I've had this conversation with gun owners who are a part of my congregation. I'll start by saying that my dad owned guns. I grew up in West Virginia. And I do think part of it is actually having the conversation. What I hear from him, though, is the version of gun ownership that is not the face of the NRA, but that is really more the membership of the NRA. I think that's the conversation that needs to happen, but that never does, because the face of gun culture and the gun ownership movement is very different than regular people who might own a gun.
Yeah. You're talking about having a faith conversation, a faith witness about gun violence, yet there is a perception, and I'm sure this comes up with secular liberal friends who may, share your thoughts about guns, but that religion has been responsible for a vast majority of the killing and violence in the history of the world. So where do you get to have a say about gun violence now?
As a Catholic, I've had to live with the history of, the dreadful thing of the Inquisition. And perhaps I should have learned it sooner, but when the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts colony, because of the persecution that they experienced in England, they made Roger Williams have to leave the Massachusetts colony, their intolerance of him, to go to Rhode Island. And the origins of the state of Rhode Island is that he was booted out of Massachusetts by people who had come to Massachusetts to escape religious persecution. It must be something very deep in human nature.
As a rabbi, I'm often in conversations with people who say, look at Israel and Palestine. I mean, look what's going on, and this is all about religion, and if it weren't for religion, this wouldn't be the case. And I actually think that if it weren't for the fact that we were human, that wouldn't be the case. That I think that we find reasons to shoot each other, to fight with each other, and that religion is a very handy excuse. But I don't think it's because of the religion. I think it's because of the people who are behind the religion. As far as I can tell, exactly, religion doesn't kill people, people do, right? Yeah, there you go. That's perfect. That is perfect. And it's true. There are good, nonviolent, religious people. And there are people who, in the name of religion, use violence. Yup. And I think it's very clear that there's a huge range. The Jewish community has always been known as nonviolent, and has always been known as, not people who ever own guns, who would ever shoot, who would ever do anything like that, until the state of Israel, and suddenly people are in political power, and there's a need for an army. Oh, there's a need for guns. Oh, what do we do? Well, we handle our political power about as well as every other people handles their political power, which is not always perfect. But it's all about the humanness.
I think as a Muslim, sort of connecting it to another part of my life, this is something that I have to answer every day since 9/11, right? Your religion is responsible for 9/11. You are responsible for 9/11, and I say stop. It's not my religion. It's certain people who claim to be Muslims. No problem with that. But do not move that into a responsibility for the religion, and then by association everybody who is part of that religion. So I think we need to, when we get that type of an argument, I think we need to sort of say stop, ex-nay on the argument, right? Because it's what philosophers call a logical fallacy, right? You just illogically attribute something that is unattributable. We need to stop that.
Have we reached a point of paralysis or refusal to act on the part of the political system where civil disobedience is called for? And what would Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi recommend to us that we do right now?
I think that Martin Luther King would say that if people are not listening, you need to wake them up. It's time to feel that it's happened. We're there. How do we get that message across? And that civil disobedience is definitely called for in our time.
You have to be motivated by something a little more passionate than just the recognition that something is wrong to engage in effective civil disobedience. Before it works, you really have to take a lot. Civil disobedience, where it works, requires great sacrifice on the part of the people who are going to engage in it. It has to be a deeper vision for what is possible. It has to be something a little radical, quite a bit radical.
The largest umbrella organization that Muslims have, called the Islamic Society of North America, the president of that organization came out and said to the imams of various mosques in the country, speak about this. As far as I'm concerned, religion is a wonderful tool to empower ourselves. Believe in something greater, believe in that which is greater and good. That is what God is greater means, Allahu Akbar. Believe in something that is greater than anything and everything you can think of, which then empowers us to strive, to change this culture.
On that eloquent note, I'd like to thank Father Jack McNamee, Rabbi Linda Holtzman, Iftikhar Hussain, and the Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan. They did a great job.